Hello and welcome to CoralVision's annual legislative preview show. Today we'll be speaking with Senator Bob Dvorsky and Representative Dave Jacoby about the upcoming Iowa legislative session for 2018. This discussion was recorded on January 3rd, 2018 at the Coralville Center for the Performing Arts. So to begin, for those who may not know their elected representatives, why don't you guys each introduce yourselves? Go, Bob.
I'm State Senator Bob Dvorsky. I live here in Coralville, and I represent Senate District 37. And for those who don't know what Senate District 37 is, outside the five of us, I have 3 precincts on the far western part of Iowa City, all of Coralville, Penn Township, and then up in the Solon area and that area around Solon, all of Cedar County and the city of Wilton. They're in Senate District 37.
Now you, Dave.
Dave Jacoby, State Representative from Coralville, Iowa, House District 74, and that is Coralville, the western part of Iowa City, and Penn Township.
It's a little bit more even. Okay, yeah. Okay, so tell us. Well, let's have Bob introduce what is the number of our session that we're going into here. I know there's a sequential number. Is this the first half or the second half of that session? And how is this session going to play out here as we go to bat here in the next couple weeks?
This is the second year of the which General Assembly? 80?
Is it 88?
87 or 88. 88. It's probably 88. We can't remember exactly, but we think it's 88 anyway. But it's the second year of that General Assembly. So each General Assembly is a 2-year. This is the second year. So in the second year, usually it usually takes 10 days less. The way the per diem is set up, it's 10 days less. So the session should be out earlier.
Yeah, the first year of a 2-year session is 110 days, and then the second year is 100 days. It's just important for everyone to know that all bills that were filed for last year, the first year, the 2-year General Assembly, those are still active. They can be reviewed and acted upon, or not acted upon, in this year also.
Okay, all right. So, Dave, in the House, what is the balance of power in the House of Representatives right now, and what does that mean in terms of committee functions and how things will proceed for the big issues that we'll face?
Well, right now we have 41 Democrats and 58 Republicans. If that number seems not to add up, that's because we have 1 open seat in western Iowa, and there will be a special election for that open seat on January 16th. So going into the session, I'm hopeful that the 2018 session, you see more bipartisan work than we saw in 2017. First of all, it'll be the budget. The budget is always number one. We'll also look at some ways we can improve the Medicaid debacle when the governor privatized Medicaid in April of 2016. It causes quite a few problems for families, individuals, and providers. And one of the things on the board too is tax reform.
Okay. Let's take a moment to talk specifically about the Medicaid privatization. Was that taken by legislative action or executive action? And how specifically has that played out in terms of those providers sticking around? And what do we do? How do we fix this problem?
This was done totally by executive action. Then Governor Branstad did it totally on his own. I don't think he even got input from the House or Senate Republicans at the time. He did it in 2016 when the Democrats were in charge of the Senate, Republicans in charge of the House. But he totally did it on his own, and there was really virtually no recourse because the Republicans who controlled the House didn't want to change anything or make any waves on it. We tried several times to have some sort of oversight, so there is an oversight group that meets 2 or 3 times a year, but they don't really have any teeth. And it really is a total executive branch screw-up done by Governor Branstad, and now the same horrendous policies are followed by Governor Reynolds.
Okay, now is this related to the policy changes that have also taken place with like the long-term care ombudsman's office? What is the deal with that situation? I understand that there were some changes that essentially nullified the ombudsman's ability to do their work. Do you know about that situation?
Yes, well, basically they've eliminated the position without out and out eliminating the position. It's not directly in tune with the Medicaid debacle, but it is a part of what's going on statewide in terms of trying to privatize everything that's involved in medicine, and also for providers. You mentioned providers earlier. Providers are no longer able to provide services because of 2 things. Number one, they're not getting paid. Many of them aren't getting paid at all. And then there's a huge number of them that are getting paid quite a bit less, that their hourly rates were adjusted, if you will, without any discussion, without any hearings, making it almost unaffordable for them to provide services. So right now we're in a crisis for those families. We're also in a crisis for providers. And without a long-term ombudsman to check on what's going on with Medicaid patients, what's going on in our care centers and our elderly, it makes it more difficult for us to get accurate information on exactly how transitions or non-transitions are affecting people in Iowa.
So one of the problems is sort of the structure of the budgets. We have 7 budget subcommittees, and they deal with a defined group of budgets. One is the Health and Human Services Appropriations Subcommittee, and they deal with everything in human services and health, and so that includes the ombudsman and all that. And what has happened, because of the cost of Medicaid and then the cost of what they're trying to do to pay these private people, they need the funds to pay that. They're cutting everything else in that budget. So they cut out long-term ombudsman and other things in the budget. So the very groups that we're trying to support in human services are being cut because they're trying to support this failed privatization effort. And I think, as Dave said also, I think they're trying to privatize other things also as they can. But it's just kind of a vicious cycle because they're cutting back on funds to provide any of the services and supports to keep people out of nursing homes or keep people off Medicaid. They're getting rid of those supports, so they fall onto Medicaid, and then now they're not paying providers. I mean, it's so bad on the providers, even such a big institution as the University of Iowa Hospitals and Clinics was having problems with enormous amounts of money owed by the management people, the MCOs, and now I think they're overcoming some of that. But just a large institution like that was kind of in arrears for a few months because of the way they're operating everything, and that's all kind of across the board. It's not just one area.
Okay, so the contractors we brought in have behaved irresponsibly and have not paid their bills and have not delivered the services that they promised.
Actually, they've pulled out of Iowa.
Really?
So the original MCOs that were part of the contract, of the 3, only 2 are left right now providing, or 1 is providing service, and the other 2 are in the act of pulling out of Iowa. And that's mainly because even though arguably they say they're losing money, but they're taking millions from the Iowa taxpayers, is that they've realized that the model it was built on is one of the worst medical health pyramid schemes that they've seen across the country. So they are pulling out now, leaving 1 provider, and that means a lot of the people who did eligibility are now on the 3rd company that they've worked with. They were working for the state, working for local, went to one MCO, then the other, and so some people don't even know who their MCO worker is, and that's people for the last 16, 18 months that have been in limbo, are in worse limbo right now, not getting services. It can be young children with special needs, it can be adult children, it can be wives and husbands or elderly parents or other family members, they are actually stressed out now. I've talked to people who've lost their jobs because they've had to stay home and help with a family member. Talked to people who actually have lost loved ones. Received a phone call from a woman whose husband was dying, but because of the Medicaid switch could not be made for him to go to hospice, that they were at the hospital paying thousands and thousands and thousands of dollars for each day of final care instead of the family's wishes to be switched from Medicare to Medicaid and go to a hospice situation. And that was a Friday when I talked to her, and the gentleman passed away on Monday. And the hospital was great enough to actually put him in a family room and do whatever they could to help the family. But getting that call on a Friday and then the MCOs reacting, saying, well, we'll get to it next week. And I said, well, this is an end-of-life situation, and the person, and this is one of the MCOs that have pulled out, said, well, we hear that a lot. And so it was just heart-wrenching, and I spent that particular weekend working with the family and working with the hospital. And again, the hospital stepped up, but it's just an unbelievable situation that we're in right now. Wow. And it's not getting better.
No.
That's what's frustrating,
Right.
is there should have been a special session on Medicaid only and bipartisan effort to make it better, whether it's reverting back to the way it was run before or a hybrid system. But there was no reaching out from the governor's office or, quite frankly, House Republicans on the Medicaid issue.
There doesn't seem to be any will by the House Republicans or the Senate Republicans for sure to do anything or make any changes, because Governor Reynolds is holding the line and saying there's nothing here to see, nothing to see here, and they try and play up using phony statistics and trying to act like everything's okay here. And it's such a disservice to Iowans. I mean, there's like 600,000 people affected who use Medicaid, plus their families and everything else. Enormous amount of people across the state. And I for the life of me, can't figure out how legislators, who Republicans or Democrats, don't hear from people and don't hear stories like Dave is talking about and everything else going on here. What a horrendous situation it is, that they at least talk about, make some changes, but it's all sort of the big lie that everything's okay and we're going to continue. And it's a total political philosophy. This is privatization, and it has to work.
Well, considering this was an action taken by the executive, what is the legislative branch's role here? What can, given the political will, if the Republicans come around and decide there is a problem that needs to be fixed, what can the legislature do to fix it?
Well, the big thing the legislature has is control power of the purse, that they're in charge of budgeting. So they could determine what they're going to do with the budgets for DHS and for Medicaid and all that. And there would have to be clear determination to say, we're not going to do anything, we're not going to move forward in any of this unless you come to the table and start looking at what the system is and what needs to be done. And there has been a little bit of talk of going back and having the state of Iowa provide some services for some discrete groups. And obviously, if they're going to do that, they could do it for others. I mean, one of the problems in this whole situation was the governor's office. I don't know, they had some consultants come in. This was under Branstad. Actually decided to change the entire system and get it done within 6 months or something like that. That'd never been done anywhere in the United States where the entire system had been changed. There'd been parts. In some places they'd done parts and worked on those, and that'd been somewhat successful. But to take the entire system, go completely from, being provided by the state of Iowa into privatizing everything within a really short time frame, it had never been done anywhere else. And there's a reason for that, because it doesn't work, and it didn't work, and now they can't back off and say we made a mistake.
But there was an opportunity there. There was an opportunity when Governor Reynolds took over as governor, when former Governor Branstad went to China as a diplomat, is that was an opportunity to do a review and say, wait a minute, maybe we rushed into it too quickly. let's back up just a few steps to see what works. Now, there have been a couple of House Republicans that have reached out to me because I've been quite vocal on the Medicaid debacle and posting it on social media. And one of them, actually Rob Taylor, drove from Des Moines to meet with me here in Coralville and talk about some options that we have. So on a bipartisan note, I think there's a number of Republicans are seeing that it's a huge mistake. Now, I think their struggle is within their own party, convincing the majority of themselves to make a change, and also convincing the governor's office to accept that change.
Does fixing this, how does fixing this situation, how would that affect the budget? Is it going to break the bank to put things right?
Well, I think we're breaking the bank right now by providing, they keep renegotiating how much they're giving to the MCOs, and that's essentially breaking the bank, but that's kind of not seen anywhere. So I don't think it's going to break the bank to go back and provide it. The system we had before, the state of Iowa was providing services, really was a good system, and the overhead was a lot cheaper and everything else. And it was increasing every year, would go up a slight amount, but they need to figure out some way to, if it's a hybrid or something else, to figure out a better way to deliver services.
And the Medicaid system is roughly based on a 2-to-1 match from the federal government. And so by not, and it was one of the big mistakes that started the dominoes falling, one of the mistakes was not the expansion of Medicaid that was offered from the federal government that the states could tie into with a larger match proportion. Now, and remember, these are taxes that all Iowans are paying in. This isn't a gimme. This isn't something just saying, hey, we're going to take money from the government. This is money that Iowans are paying into the federal government, and it had the option to come back to Iowa to expand Medicaid for people that are working. And that's one of the myths that are out there. People on Medicaid are working individuals, and a lot of them are people that cannot work because they're elderly or severe disabilities. So, and I believe it's about 60% are working 1, 2, and 3 jobs. They just can't afford their health insurance too. And these are usually families with children.
And it's not general fund stuff. It's a separate system, right?
Well, the general fund does, and the senator can correct me if I'm wrong because he ran appropriations for a number of years. It's a general fund, but that comes from that 1/3 match that we invest in the Medicaid system too.
We have to pick up the match from the federal government. One of the great myths out there is this whole thing about Medicaid, that these are people maybe who are not working and just lazy or whatever. I mean, the vast majority of people on the system are either elderly or people with disabilities. And you know, if people really knew who they were and what services they're getting, I think it'd be a lot different. There'd be more outcry out there from, you know, sort of regular people that the problems. But especially in Iowa, there's a lot of elderly involved in this, and people with disabilities. And that's who's not being served on this, and your heart just goes out to the families trying to deal with this whole situation. Has been taken care of. First of all, if you have somebody with disability as a child or even an adult, it's an enormous sacrifice to work with them and do everything else. I mean, my wife taught special education for a number of years, 30+ years. And just to get those services in the schools, you have to fight every day to do that, let alone trying to get this Medicaid thing going. So,
anything else on Medicaid issues?
Well, before we move on, I think it's important that everyone knows these are your neighbors. It's not someone who lives in a particular part of town or what you may think. It's actually everyone's friends and neighbors. People just aren't real vocal about where they might be getting some of their medical coverage, and they don't need to be. It's their family business, but it is friends and neighbors.
If legislative action comes across the board on this issue, what committee would it come from, and what part of the session would it actually happen?
Human Resources?
Yeah, either there's a Human Resources Standing Committee or there's the Health and Human Resources Appropriations Committee that does the budget. So it could be either language in the budget or actual standalone bill in Human Resources. So they could figure out whatever the best way to deal with it is. One of the things they may want to do is if they actually wanted to solve this, is we're going to go back into session and we'll have to do a de-appropriation right away, which means we have to look, because the revenues aren't coming in as high as projected, we have to go and make cuts in this current fiscal year. So we have to go in and do that and change the budget. So that would be an opportunity if you needed to change the budget to do something with Medicaid, you could do it at that time because they have to do the de-appropriation.
Okay.
I mean, we're required by the Constitution to do that, to have a balanced budget. And if the revenues aren't coming in, you have to make cuts. So unfortunately, there's going to be cuts made.
But the revenues are positive.
Right.
I mean, that's part of the myth out there too, is that we're losing a lot of money. The revenue streams in Iowa are still increasing. They're just not increasing at the rate that the Revenue Estimating Conference had thought they would a year ago. And it's important to note when you ask a question about Medicaid and funding, we've already, or they, depending if you want to get real political about it, have used 100 to 150 million in our reserve funds. These are monies that are meant for an economic emergency, not necessarily arguably mismanaging the budget. And that's what you see now. And as the senator mentioned, we're not talking about next year's fiscal year, we're talking about the year we're in.
Year.
And here we are
Between now and June.
Right.
between now and June 30th, and here we are today in the third quarter of this fiscal year. So any further cuts in a current fiscal year when you're over halfway done is even more difficult. So, and I suspect cities and counties better buckle up, because to balance the budget, there is a proposal to take back the backfill that goes to cities and counties.
Okay.
And again, that's so difficult because it's not planning ahead for next fiscal year. It's in the fiscal year that we're currently in and that we're currently over halfway through.
Contracts that are already let, people who are already on the schedule. So other than the backfill, what other services are likely to be take that impact from budget cut?
Well, unfortunately, why do they rob banks? Because that's where the money is. Why do they, going into the middle of a fiscal year and trying to cut, you have to cut where the money is. So the big money is in education. I mean, 60-some% of the budget's in education. So unfortunately, they're going to be looking at the regions, community colleges, maybe private colleges, maybe K through 12. Although hopefully they won't touch K through 12, but they're going to be looking at education cuts, and they're going to be looking at DHS cuts because there's a lot of money there. I mean, it's just part of that horrible cycle that we need to get away from that. But so there's going to be tremendous cuts there. A little bit about the backfill. We mentioned backfill, and I'm sure people out there probably their eyes glaze over and say, "What are you talking about, backfill?"
It's kind of like rollback. Your eyes roll back.
It's like rollback, yeah.
Yes.
Well, a few years ago, what year did we do it?
2013.
2013, we property tax. We tried to cut back on the amount that commercial property tax people were paying, and so to do that, we put money into that. The whole amount was
About 300 million
about 300
per year.
per year, and because the cities and counties wouldn't get that revenue, we backfilled part of it. We were backfilling part of it for 10 years, which a total each year of 150 or something like that.
It's about 159 million for the backfill, and then 140 million for the business tax credit that goes along with it.
So that 159 million that the cities and counties were getting will have to be made up somewhere if they go in and cut that. And they were promised to have that for 10 years so they could sort of figure out how to deal with it, after 10 years. But this is the fourth or fifth year that we're doing that.
We're in year 4.
We're in year 4, and that's not quite 10. But obviously it will be a tremendous impact on cities and counties. And a lot of cities and counties, or cities anyway, are at their probably 8-10 limit now on levying property taxes anyway. So
Okay.
plus if it hits during the middle of the fiscal year, they have to certify their budgets on March 15th.
In March.
So that's going to be a major problem also for cities and counties if any of that is cut.
So that backfill payment would be coming out of cities and counties FY18 budget? Or are we talking about monies that would be budgeted for their FY19?
Well, for some, the checks haven't been written yet because you have to file what the total is. Each local entity files for what their denominator is and what that repayment would be. Some of the proposals right now would be to eliminate the repayment by 30%. And 30% or roughly 1/3 of 150 million is about 50 million, and that's part of the hole that they're trying to fill. I think it's important to remember two things when it comes to the commercial property tax thing. The number one revenue stream for the state of Iowa is personal income tax, and then sales tax is second. Somewhat distant, but still important. So we're using personal income tax to backfill the commercial property tax valuation. Then what happens, and this is coming more true, is then property taxes go up for the homeowners. So doing a number of forums, I've always asked, tell me if your property taxes have gone down or up. Not a single person said their property taxes are going down.
Even if they were.
Even if they were.
Even if the levy was going down.
Even
Right.
if the levy was going down because of a number of factors. Was commercial tax too high? Personally, I think it was. It was at 100% of valuation, and homes, residences are taxed at the rollback at about 53% right now. I think that's where it's at. But you squeeze the balloon, it comes out somewhere, and where it comes out is usually for the homeowners to pay more. And that's for your schools, your cities, and your county. So that's part of the balloon we're seeing being squeezed right now too.
Yeah, the dirty little secret in all this is this whole tax reform thing. We tweak one part of that, which is commercial property taxes. We also have the ag land tax, and we have the homeowners residential tax. And the way those are taxed are really completely different. And if you ever saw the numbers, it's fairly stark as to how much, if you own commercial versus ag versus residential. And someday it's going to be after I leave the Iowa legislature, but someday hopefully they're going to look at everything, and as Dave said for years, decouple ag from
ag and residential.
Because it's not sustainable. I don't think the way it's set up right now.
Okay, there's a linkage between private property tax levies and
Residential,
ag.
yes.
Yeah.
Residential and ag.
Residential and ag.
And
They
how
were,
does that work exactly?
well, they were a couple decades ago during the farm crisis, and what it was meant to do was kind of even out any swings in property tax valuations or devaluations. And it may have had some merit there in the early 80s, late 70s, early 80s, but now what it does is it artificially, so if ag land is very productive and corn prices are up, it actually means our homes go up in the city too. Then the same happens, it can go down, but rarely does a homeowner's valuation go down in town, if you will. So it favors ag considerably, and it leaves residential, again, footing the bill.
Oh.
And the ag is taxed on a 5-year rolling average based on production. So it takes about 5 years to sort of get that in place. So it really is a convoluted system that really is hard to tell. But if you look at how much you pay per valuation, the ag land pays very smaller amount.
Considerably less than
Yeah.
And commercial was paying a higher amount too at the
Yeah.
time. Now
So they're not levied based on a property value.
No, used to be.
No.
Used to be, but they changed that to this production thing here several years ago.
is based on the productivity, quote unquote, of the land, and also there's exemptions for your business buildings on your property. So it's a different construct, and it's not, my wife is from Rockwell City, Calhoun County, and when I talk to locals there about keeping their schools open, their struggle is we really want our schools to stay open, but they're not actually, to be honest with you, paying for it because their property tax valuations are so much lower. When you're in Coralville and you're paying $6,000 a year for your property taxes, and the biggest chunk goes to education, then the next level goes to the city, and the third level to the county. In some of our rural areas, they're paying hundreds of dollars, not thousands of dollars, but honest to gosh, hundreds of dollars.
For ag land?
For ag land, and that you can't fund school districts. And so it's just an interesting way of taxation, and I think we need at some point to equalize that. And I'm hoping someday, statewide, bipartisan, eastern, western Iowa, east of 35, west of 35, we can come together and figure out the best way to put funding sources together to keep those schools open. Because in my humble opinion, the same gentleman I was at Casey's having a cup of coffee with, who is saying, you got to save our schools, but we don't want to raise our taxes. And I'm saying, well, there's only so much that I think people from the rural area, from Coralville, Iowa, and Iowa City, want to throw into the hopper to keep your school open, when we look there and say, we're paying 10 times as much as you are, and we're also trying to help you keep your school open. It's not fair.
And the school aid formula is really based on the theory that the state puts a fundamental amount under each child. It's about $6,500 right now.
Right.
And that the theory is, if you live in Red Oak, Iowa, your education system should be as good as one in Iowa City, or a fundamental basis of good education. And to do that, then everything is going through the formula in that. So a school district, Iowa City Community School District, which is called property rich, doesn't really benefit by the formula. If we were left on our own, I mean, if you were left on your own in this district, you'd probably drop the property taxes a lot. Mm-hmm. But that's not the way the system works. So we're actually sort of subsidizing a lot of other districts across the state to make the formula fair enough so everybody has equal opportunity to get a good education in Iowa.
And I apologize to the people watching the video. We're getting kind of geeky.
We are sorry.
In the
No,
weeds.
Sorry.
And
This
it's
is
policy,
the
but it is something that I know people are interested in, and it's extremely difficult to explain school finance.
Yeah.
And
This is the private meeting with your legislators that most people don't get to have.
Well, and it's unfortunate because everybody does things at sound bites and all that, and that's not the way the world works. It certainly isn't the way the world works in Des Moines either.
Well, since we're on fairness in education funding, let's bring up an issue that we'll probably see in the next few months, and that is school vouchers, savings accounts, and charter schools. The alternative sphere to public schools. We're going to see some proposals come forth. What is that going to look like, and how are you guys going to be reacting to that as it comes across?
Well, one of the first proposals that I've heard, and this has come from the Republican team, is their proposal for ESA, education savings accounts, would actually send that check to the parents, no matter where the child was going to school. So if a check came to the Jacoby household because youngest daughter Anna is a senior at West High, they would send us a check for $6,000, whatever the allowable growth rate is, and then it would be up to us to pay the school. So even public schools are saying we could go to a voucher system where the parents are paying it. Well, it's problematic because How do you get a check out to each parent? How do you make sure those checks are going to the school where the child is going? And it's a matter of money. If I have 2 children in school at one time, which I did for a number of years, that'd be roughly $13,000. So you could be writing checks bigger to families than they're actually putting into the system. And that can go for people that homeschool, people that may go to a private school, or the people that choose to go to a public school. Education savings accounts do not affect in any way, positive or negative, school choice. If you choose for your child to go to a different school, you have that choice in front of you. If you choose to homeschool, you have that choice in front of you. The difference is the amount of money that we're going to invest in public education, where 480,000 of our students in Iowa attend, and then roughly, is it 40,000?
40 or 50, I think, for
It's
privates.
around, it's under 10%
Yeah.
of the total number of schools involved in the K-12 system. And it's our responsibility that there's a public school open for these children, and it's also our responsibility that it's a quality and innovative education. And we can't do that if we have a savings account that's sending checks out to all individual parents.
Yeah, because there's going to be a lot of those checks that don't get to schools at all. Families in distress, people who have material stresses, and that money's going to go away, and those parents are still going to say, well, I need school for my
Yeah,
child.
my children still need to go to school regardless. And the math doesn't work real well, and that's just my opinion. But the math doesn't work well when you look at the average amount a household is paying in state income tax. Yeah. And then how many of those households, and remember, anytime you're eligible to receive a check from the state government, there's a lot of things that go along with that too. If, for instance, if we're saying anyone that receives Medicaid support or a check from the government in aid to dependent children, they're saying, well, they have to do drug checks and they have to do background checks. Are we going to do background checks and drug testing for 100,000 parents in Iowa? I don't know how you would do that. And I think it's getting lost in what they're trying to propose, and it's rather radical. But we do have some radical thinking people at the State House right now too.
We really do. So,
in the most positive light, what do they think they're trying to accomplish?
I don't know. There's been a fundamental attack on public education in Iowa the last few years, especially in the Iowa Senate and in the Iowa House somewhat also, that really they don't believe in public education. Mm-hmm. And this is just another way to cut into public education, to not fund it. I mean, they don't believe that we ought to be funding K through 12 education. I mean, the great leveler of society, public education in the United States, has done all these great things all these years, and now we're looking at trying to cut into that. The other situation is private schools in Iowa and the parochial schools and all that. They get some of the best benefits of any states. I mean, we pay for transportation, we pay for scholarships, special ed, all sorts of other things. We almost barely, some of it's just barely constitutional because we shouldn't be allowed to do that. But the benefits that accrue to private schools in Iowa is really off the charts. And to go beyond that is really beyond, this is just a fundamental attack on public education. That's the way it needs to be viewed all the time. I mean, there's all these mechanisms here to try and cut back on how much give money for private education and then cut back on what public education is getting. So
it seems like it's trying to make our public school brick and mortars essentially private schools. So taking public funds, public education funds, and making them available for anyone to do any private or that.
And as Representative Jacoby said, it's not really school choice. I mean, we do open enrollment and all sorts of other things now that you can have school choice and those sort of things. And there are still charter schools in Iowa too that operate. But it really is a fundamental attack on public education in Iowa.
And we do currently, as you mentioned, we do currently support the private schools to the tune of about $54 million a year.
Right.
So we are supportive of the private schools. I'm a St. Joseph Elementary School in Marion, Iowa product, and that was my parents' choice to send us to the Catholic elementary school. And then, of course, I graduated from Marion High School, a public school. So it was our choice to have the best of both worlds. And by no means, and my parents will tell us to this day, that was our choice, and that's what we paid for. That we shouldn't be given any money for the private schools. That was our personal choice.
How does the federal government play into this situation? Because the federal Department of Education is deeply involved in our education system as well.
Is there still a federal Department of Education?
Yeah.
Okay, because there's been works to dismantle that for whatever reasons.
Secretary DeVos really believes in charter schools and all that. And the state where she's promoted that is Michigan. They failed miserably there. The federal government, we had all this No Child Left Behind and all those horrible programs the last few years. Mm-hmm. Prior to that, the federal government didn't have a lot of say, so it really is a local issue. I mean, I think the number used to be about what percentage do schools receive from the federal government. It's like 7%. So it really isn't until they did No Child Left Behind, and that was just sort of the force of the federal government not really putting good, decent funding into it. Mm-hmm. They don't really have that much say-so on what goes on. Fortunately, if you have a secretary like Secretary DeVos, I mean, horrible, no understanding of K through 12 education, mm-hmm. no understanding of how charter schools go into or private schools or anything. Mm-hmm. Shouldn't have been confirmed at all, and it's unfortunate.
Okay.
Well, there is a mindset that with some people too that serve in both chambers that, and this is a direct quote, which only happened maybe 3-4 weeks ago. Actually, it was in November at a school event, and that elected official who serves in the Senate said, the best way for classroom innovation, Dave, is if we go back to one-room schoolhouses. And there was a person with me who said, gosh, didn't know that's really how people thought. And another person too, and this has been a couple of years back, said one way to save money on public education is if the moms stayed home and taught the kids until they were at least 11 or 12, and we wouldn't need elementary schools, we would just need junior highs and high schools. So, and that was, so it's, that is some of the mindset. Certainly, I wouldn't think the majority of the majority, but a significant number of people who feel that way about education in Iowa. So, obviously, it's not a thought that I share. The schools did, the public schools of my kids have done so well.
Might have some economic impacts.
It might have a few impacts that both economic and social, I would say too, but that is part of the mindset that sometimes you're up against.
Yeah, people need to understand that there's really fundamental differences in the way people view things in the state of Iowa, and I think it's part of what's going on at the federal level also. I mean, this sort of attitude they're doing, they're really going into institutions that have served us well for years, trying to cut those back because of a real narrow view of the way things work and the way things worked maybe 50 years ago. We can't go backwards. I mean, we can't go back to 50, 60 years ago the way things supposedly worked and happened, and a lot of people in Des Moines really want to do that. I mean, if they were allowed to do that, they would go back to the 50s or the 1850s maybe, some of them. So, I mean, really, that's their attitudes.
Well, the 1950s, my mom says that every time I go home. Everyone wants to go back to the 1950s, and I'm here to tell you, the 50s weren't all that great. So, and she lived it, and my dad served in Korea in the 50s, so I think they know a little bit of what they're talking about.
Yeah. Yeah, there were some significant challenges to overcome there, and they're still playing out in society.
And I know we want to move on it, but to close out on the public education, I think what it does when we have these discussions on accounts is it takes away from the real discussion we should have, and that's on adequate funding, but also innovation in the schools.
Okay.
Because we have so many teachers working so hard and administrators working so hard. This year-to-year arm wrestling over funding. How can administrators help push our kids forward and be more innovative and raise those test scores and have kids that want to be entrepreneurs and even more successful after graduation when we're arguing about savings accounts, and we should be on this track saying, how can we keep this competitive, innovative for our students coming through the schools?
So the real fight is usually about this percent increase, which is the first round of the budget fight. What is the number that we should be, in your opinion, aspiring to, and how will that negotiation play out?
Well, the number is probably 4 or 5%. I would think a legitimate number, but that's not even going to be brought up. I mean, because we're in the more, I hope people understand if you're in the minority, and we're both in the deep minority in the Senate. In the Senate, there's 29 Republicans, 1 independent, and 20 Democrats. So with 20 Democrats, you really can't have a lot of say-so on things. You need 26 to pass anything. And because we're in the deep minority, very little say-so or discussion of what the number will be in the allowable growth. I think I've heard 0 from some Republicans that to move that forward, and they're interested in getting it done quickly. But if you give them 0, that doesn't really help anything.
Yeah, if you just looked at a flat line cost of living, or the cost of doing business, or the cost of being successful, you would probably establish that at least 3%, 4% would be optimal. And we've talked about it a number of times. You have a steady increase every year, but you also can tie something to that as far as innovation. It just isn't a carte blanche increase. But when you leave school budgets at 0% or 1%, then every year the school administrators are spending more time on balancing that budget than they are in the classroom of innovation. So you hear that from the school boards, from superintendents, from the principals. We're supposed to set that amount by February 1st?
Yeah,
I
think it was the 15th.
Or February 15th?
I think it's February 15th.
In the first
Early
4 or 5
February,
weeks of the session, it's supposed to be set. And that's for the following fiscal year. And a lot of local entities certify their budgets in March. When we wait till the end of April or even into May to determine that amount, then you have administrators or half your administrative team just working on numbers when they should be working on other things. So it's a little frustrating there. I think what we need to do is hammer it out in the first couple weeks. Win or lose, I don't think we're going to win.
I don't think we will either, unfortunately.
4%. I would consider it successful if we walked out with 2.5, but I don't see that happening either. 4% is really what we should have. And you look at states, one of the states that is kind of blowing past this is North Carolina. Now, North Carolina does have a Democratic governor, but and their legislature is not, but they have made a bipartisan effort to invest in students, and their per pupil aid is almost twice of what Iowa puts into invest in each student. And I think North Carolina has made the smart decision. They said if we're going to invest in the future, our future is our students and our kids, and so they've made that jump. So nothing against North Carolina, but good heavens, we're going to be behind North Carolina in education. We used to be number 1, and I don't want to keep harping on the education piece, but a woman I know who was a retired military person, she actually moved back to Iowa so her children could finish their education. and said, we moved back because education was #1 in Iowa. She goes, when I was in the military and traveled everywhere in the U.S. and overseas, everyone knew that Iowa was #1 in education. And then she looked at me and said, Dave, my grandkids will probably not move back here because Iowa's not #1 because we haven't invested in education the way we should. She goes, we can get back there, but we're not there right now. So that was interesting to hear her say that.
North Carolina is a really object lesson, I think, on leadership. But way back in the 90s, there's a Democrat governor of North Carolina named Jim Hunt. He later became the Secretary of Education at the federal level. But some of the reforms he put in place way back in the 90s have led North Carolina.
Time to bring it up too, but we have to look at what the limits were. The origination of IPERS was to protect people who were working hard so they'd have something to retire. Was IPERS meant for people who are earning $180,000 a year? That's one of the questions out there, and I think that's a legitimate one to go after. But IPERS as a whole is in Iowa one of the strongest, if not the strongest, pension system in the country right now.
And under the hood, it works like an investment fund, like any other, and investment funds are doing fairly well right now, right?
Well, as Dave said, IPERS, Iowa Public Employees Retirement System. And almost all public employees in Iowa are in, as you said, teachers, state employees, county employees, city employees. There are a couple other smaller systems that are out there. There's one is the PORS, the police officers retirement system, was for patrol and that sort of thing. And then there's 411 systems, which are retirement for police and fire in larger cities in Iowa. So those are the retirement systems. By far, the vast majority of public employees are under IPERS. Just as a note, myself, I'm actually collecting IPERS now because I was in the IPERS system for a number of years.
How old are you?
Yeah, 102. So, but it really is a model nationwide. The IPERS system is. I mean, I remember talking to the former city manager, Mr. Marcus, and he worked in Michigan. He said every city had their own system in Michigan. I mean, that's god awful. Tiny little cities trying to run their own retirement system, and most of them went bankrupt. I mean, that's ridiculous. So this is a statewide system that really makes a lot of sense to bring everybody on board. And several years ago, they looked at the system to determine, they needed to put more funds into it. So they bit the bullet and they raised how much people in the system had to put into it, and also raised
employees and
employers. We did that how many years ago? That put it in really.
Is that 10 years or is it longer?
Maybe 10. Representative Masher actually serves on this board, so she would know exactly what the year we did that. And since then, it's really moved forward to, they talk about a liability, there's a small liability in the system over time, but it really is well run and really gives a good thing for public employees. And years ago, public employees weren't paid close to what the private sector was making, but the one thing they had was a retirement system. And now that a state is a good retirement system for public employees in the state. And there's always these talks of a tax on IPERS and changing it the way it's set up and everything. And right now it seems to be people in the Iowa Senate, as I said, they're really, really conservative. They're looking at it, and they brought in a Koch brothers ally that came up with some sort of phony recommendations on it. Actually, they said not to change it, though, didn't they?
Yeah.
They brought in their Koch brothers person. They actually said don't change it, which surprised everybody.
Well.
Yeah.
But the House people weren't in favor of doing that, and so they didn't even go to the meeting. So you got the House, who I think wants to leave IPERS the way it is, and then you have some people in the Senate who wants to change it. And I don't know if they'll change it for current people in the system, or they'll just wait to new people getting into the system.
And you mentioned the 411, which is important for paid fire departments and for our police. And the 411 system is one of the major recruiting tools for people to come in as police officers. And if you were to eliminate that defined benefit program for police officers, my guess is talk to city administrators or police chiefs, and it would be tougher to recruit men and women for that position.
Because they have 20 years and
20 years, 20 and 30. So
Yeah.
Okay.
so.
All right.
And there are some communities like Coralville that aren't in the, but they're in IPERS, but they have a thing called protected class, which deals with police and fire and that sort of thing. So it's a little different system.
Okay, it's a niche in there. The switch from defined benefit to defined contribution, however, would limit the income of people who serve only 20 years, perhaps, or who retire early. Is that where savings would come? Would savings actually, is that actually the issue?
Well, there's an argument that you would save money, but the fees up front for those investments remain the same. And also, you're dependent on more on Wall Street than your governing board.
You're not guaranteed.
Okay.
Yeah, IPERS has a governing board, and I feel better that we have a number of people keeping an eye on it. Your defined contribution, you're relying on maybe one person.
Oh,
Maybe one person to make
Bernie
those
Madoff, yeah, I think he's the one that will
to
make
make
the
those
investments.
investments for
right.
you, and so you could honestly have sunk in $500,000 over your work life towards your retirement and end up with zero.
so the idea is to shift investment risk onto the retiree.
Yes.
Okay.
That's
So then
better
you hire Bernie Madoff and you're fine, right?
Okay, all right. That makes a lot more sense because risk is expensive. Ask anyone in the insurance business.
Right.
Yeah.
Okay.
It's a privatization thing again. It's another Koch brothers, ALEC, all that sort of thing.
Okay.
They've been pushing that all over the United States. It's not anything new here in Iowa.
Oh, wow. Well, I want to change the subject before you guys get completely tired out. We're going long form today. And I don't want to let you, Bob, get away without having a chance to ask you about, ask you to reflect a little bit on your career. You are rounding out a long term of service, 20, 30 years in the Iowa City.
It'll be 32 years in the House and Senate together.
So give us the details about how you came to public service, your previous service on the Coralville City Council, et cetera, and some of your key accomplishments over your tenure.
I served. I moved back here from Mason City, Iowa, when I worked in Parks and Recreation, and I'd seen some people who served in the city council up there, and I thought, well, I can do as well or better than those people. So I came back to my hometown of Coralville and ran for city council, and I ended up serving 7 years on the Coralville City Council. I served one 4-year term, and then ran for the second 4-year term, and then got elected to the Iowa House. I served about 7 years in the Iowa House. And then in 1994, there was a special election for the Iowa Senate. So I've been in the Iowa Senate since '94, and I'll be finishing out in 2018 in the Iowa Senate.
All right.
Accomplishments, I always feel embarrassed sort of talking about things that we've done over the years. A couple areas that I worked in, though, one is trying to promote funding for the regents and not only University of Iowa, but UNI and Iowa State. And so we've done over the years a lot of brick and mortar things there. We did really good work during the floods, I guess fortunately or unfortunately. We gave the regents, University of Iowa, $100 million from the state, and then they said they would turn that into $500 million for various buildings and projects. They ended up like $516 million. So that magician, Doug True, and others came up with that and did. So you see that reflected in Hampshire and all sorts of buildings across the campus and that sort of thing. Also, during the floods of 2008, I represented part of Lynn County then. And so we dealt with the situation in Cedar Rapids and did a lot of projects there through iJobs to bring them back and help them come back from the floods and talk to them about what I called hope projects, to give people hope that we're going to rebuild and do things. So they built a lot of things, the Paramount Theater, the library, the United Way building. That was one of the first ones they did through iJobs and got Cedar Rapids back in place. And then a lot of things in Coralville dealing with iJobs and dealing with the flood situation here. We're finishing up now on the last one they've done. I think at the end they're going to have spent something like $75 million on systems in Coralville to protect us from floods and the whole situation, because it's going to flood again sometime, so we have to deal with that. So dealt with all those things. One of the exciting things I was involved in is we created a new college at the University of Iowa, the College of Public Health, with their new building, opened several years ago. That was one of the things we were involved in. All sorts of other things at the university on all sorts of other buildings and programs that have moved forward, as well as University of Iowa hospitals and clinics, a lot of programs there and things moving forward there. Trying to think, obviously a lot of things in Coralville, not only dealing with the flood, but other things. One of the things Dave and I worked together on is to put in place funding to build training facilities for the Coralville Volunteer Fire Department. And it's used by all kinds of other volunteer departments and other departments in this area. We've done all sorts of other things in Coralville. Sometimes they're hard to remember exactly. Having worked in community-based corrections, did a lot of things in those areas. We expanded our prison here in the IMCC 3 different times to reflect what was going on in that area. We've done some changes in law to make it easier to move up and down the correctional continuum in corrections, and a couple other things in that area to deal with corrections. I haven't dealt with corrections in a number of years because of an appropriation. I guess one of the things that's, to me, is an accomplishment, I served 12 years as appropriations chair, and people say that may be a record. People burn out easily, I guess, in those jobs. But that is kind of an amazing run, working with Senator Gronstall and others to do that. So K through 12, there's been a lot of trying to promote K through 12 all through 30 years, trying to get decent allowable growth and trying to move schools forward, that sort of thing. A couple areas you might not think I worked on. One thing I worked on was called the Assistive Devices Bill, which means assistive devices for people with disabilities, aka wheelchairs. Lemon law for wheelchairs, and it took us about 3 years to move that forward. But now there's a law in place where if your wheelchair, if something happens to it, the manufacturer and the people they sold it to you are required to give you a loaner and to provide to make sure they're taken care of and all that. It took us 3 years. We weren't getting the manufacturers or the dealers to be on board, and they ended up with some people with disabilities picketing some of those places. That did the trick. So we actually came in, and as I said, we finally got it going, and those things passed. That's part of working with issues with people with disabilities. Worked on those things for a number of years. There's just a number of things I worked on. Unfortunately, sometimes unless somebody triggers what it was, I don't remember how it was. Had the opportunity. I think the exciting thing of working on appropriations and on other committees is you work with all kinds of different situations and different bills and things and different issues, and that's been pretty exciting dealing with that. I've had the opportunity to have a prison in my district, IMCC. Iowa Medical Classification Center. We have now the Kirkwood regional facility where Dave's office is. That's an amazing facility that we were able to put that together. I have the largest park in Iowa, Lake McBride. That's in my district. And we dealt with various things over there. And now with my district, it's a more rural district, so I have a lot of rural land, and I have a few wind farms, and some other things. So about anything that's out there in the state, we had the opportunity to deal with. I mean, Coralville and Iowa City and University, we have transit systems. We worked on bills to approve that several years ago, to move that forward. I think the last time we upped the levy, we were able to do that years and years ago. Judicial system, that's one of the things as appropriation chair, you deal with the courts. And they're separate and equal branch of government, so it's a little tricky to deal with that. But unfortunately, we've done a horrendous job the last few years of trying to fund them at a decent level to keep the court system going. And unfortunately, that's something the majority's not seen fit to fund properly. But we keep trying to do what we can in that area. They've made a lot of progress over the last several years to streamline the court system and provide equal justice to everybody across the state. So And then obviously a lot of social issues we're dealing with DHS issues and other things. And local government issues, I mean, county government and city government issues, having been a former city council member, a lot of issues in those areas also. So,
Yeah.
anyway, it's been a great run. Other than the last year and probably this year, those 2 years were the worst years I ever dealt with in Des Moines, and I'm unfortunate about that. But before, we were in the minority, but the Republicans, when we were in the minority back several years ago, we didn't have these radical ideas. I mean, they were more sort of regular conservative Republicans that just wanted everything to move forward. And that's not true now. Now they want to shut down government and try and change the way things operate in this state.
If I remember correctly, when I saw a picture of Bob on the Coralville City Council,
Scary.
there were no gray hairs.
That's right. That's
No
right.
gray hairs, and I'd like to thank Bob not only for his exemplary service as an elected person, but also as being a friend. What some people didn't know is that Bob and I worked together decades ago, and we were both working in youth employment and training programs,
JTPA.
helping area youth find jobs, learn soft job hunting skills, complete high school, go on to post-secondary training. And so we've had a history before, and also for better or worse, Bob and Sue talked me into this. So to run for Coralville City Council and as a state rep. So I want to thank you. I think my wife wants to thank you. I'm sure she does, but I really appreciate everything you've done, not only for the Jacobys, but for the area you serve.
Wow.
Thank you.
Wow.
I also would note that I actually served in the city council with Jim Fawcett, so that's an achievement right there.
Yeah, that's quite notable, especially with Mayor Fawcett's history as supporting public transit in our
Yes,
in our
he was
area.
one of the original transit board of trustees. Okay, yes.
Yep, I miss Jim.
Yep.
We all do for sure. One follow-up question on that. I know you're probably not ready to endorse a successor, but can you say a few words about the kinds of qualities you'd like to see in the person who occupies your Senate seat next?
Well, there are two really good candidates running right now. Janice Weiner, who lives in Iowa City, actually grew up in Coralville, and she worked for the State Department for a number of years, had a really good background. And Zach Walls, who's living in Coralville, and probably he's fairly well known for a lot of the things he's done and dealing with Boy Scouts and two moms and all that sort of thing. And so they're two distinctively different people, but I think they have really good qualities to serve in the Iowa Senate. One of the things that I've kind of noticed that my friend Kevin Kinney, who just is completing his first term, came in and always said, you know, there's so much to learn and how you deal with these things and how can I figure out how to deal with these. He's always worried about that. But Kevin has the ability to work with people and sit down and talk to people and get them to work and move things forward. And that's something that people need to have in Des Moines. I mean, there's still, even though majority, minority, you need to work with whoever's there. Whoever was elected, they were elected as well as I was. You need to be able to work with them and do the best you can and move things forward. And I think that's the key, is somebody who knows how to deal with people and knows how to get the best out of other people and be true to your word and stick to your principles.
Excellent. Well, that nails it. That really nails it. Okay, so let's bring it back around to the challenges ahead of us right now over the next 6 to 8 weeks. Specifically, what kinds of issues would each of you like for the constituents here in Coralville and adjacent areas to be watching the news for, and how shall we contribute to your efforts there in terms of communicating with members of the executive, other legislators, and communicating with you? What is going to happen and how can we help?
Well, the best ideas I've ever had weren't my ideas. Those are ideas that usually come from constituents, friends, and neighbors. And that's one thing I like to encourage is people to contact. You don't have to wait for an issue to come up. If there's something that you think would move Iowa forward, please get a hold of us. Send us an email, or better yet, we both love it when people come to visit the Capitol during session. And if you just give us a little heads up that you're coming to town, we'll be at the Capitol, make sure that we make the time to show you around, and maybe even talk to people who are also involved in the issue that might concern someone. We've talked about the budget, education, Medicaid, possible tax reform, that kind of thing. Any ideas in those realms? Always look forward to reading those or hearing from people. Again, email, phone call, visit the Capitol. But, in closing, the best ideas have come from friends and neighbors and everyone that visits or sends us some ideas.
Even though we are in the minority, we keep working away at various issues, and Dave is correct, all the different things we can receive from people, so they let us know how these policies are affecting them, and if they do have ideas on how to move things forward. I had a couple people that were dealing with the situation of their son that had a series of dealing with violent outbursts and that sort of thing because of some mental health situations. And maybe we're putting a bill together to see it, so the facilities will let them know when that sort of thing happens. They aren't required to do that right now. So at times their son would be away from a facility and nobody knew, and they weren't informed of what he was doing, and that's not required right now. So those sort of situations we need to deal with. So that's as Dave said, that's one of the ways we get bills that actually work, because they're based on people's personal experience with government and how they do that. But we get a lot of people from this area that come to Des Moines a lot. So, I mean, there's a lot of people there. That's appreciated. I mean, last year that was the most amount of constituents that ever came to Des Moines. I guess one day they counted like 4,500 people through the turnstiles to come in to lobby. Unfortunately, most of the things they lobbied for didn't go through. But people can't quit. They need to keep doing that and letting us know that these are issues that they're concerned about and what their concerns are. And maybe as Dave said, maybe we can come up with some solutions that the Republicans might buy.
Excellent. That feels like a good place to wrap it up, but there's one more thing that I want to ask you guys to each address, and that is the nationwide movement to reform our attitudes towards sexual harassment, sexual abuse in the workplace. And I know we have an important case going on right now in the Iowa Senate, or perhaps it's already passed. There's some things to discuss about that. What can we do as Iowans to live out our values for equality and justice for people of all genders?
Well, you're probably talking to a pair of the right guys. We're both fathers of daughters.
Right.
Both have two daughters, and as a father, personally, I have a daughter who's gone through some things that were rough and sexual harassment and bullying. I can say that the good thing about the movement is there's an awareness, but it's an awareness again. What we really have to make sure is that we have everyone aware of what is right and what is wrong. And there's a little struggle right now to define what that is. But we have to make sure that every person is valued and that we don't have the bullying going on, that we don't have the sexual harassment that took place with the Senate Republicans, which is there's no place for that, much less at the state capitol. And a lesser note, because no one should ever be harassed, that the taxpayers have to pick up the bill for their mistake. But I think overall we have to look at the Me Too effort, what's going on with women in the workplace, what's going on with men in the workplace, and reevaluate. I call it, it's a darn good year for us all to rebase.
Yeah. All right. I just had a light die, I think.
But
Some stuff die over there. All right. So Bob.
Yeah, as you noted, there's been major problems with the Republicans in the Iowa Senate and their situation dealing with one of their former staff members who was sexually harassed and went to their bosses, and nothing really ever happened. But it was a succession of bosses, actually, and nothing ever happened. So she went to court. Yeah. And she won big time, and now the state is paying out I believe it's $1.75 million because the Senate Republicans failed to act and failed to take into account any of her concerns and that sort of thing. And you know, the last several years we have put in place some training for senators. We do it once the first year of the 2-year cycle, where we have a meeting and they explain sort of, frankly, I don't think the training's been that good. I think we could do better training, but the idea of having training is useful, I think. But I think we need to look further into that. And I know Leader Dix has really mishandled this whole thing. I mean, they brought in. He denies that anything was done here or anything essentially happened. I mean, she was then fired, and she was fired, he says, because of poor performance. Well, clearly she was fired because she brought up these allegations, and he's sticking by that. And they brought in, which I thought, you know, it'd be smart if they brought in maybe an independent person to look at human resources and to look at sexual harassment. So they brought in a former Republican president of the Iowa Senate who has some human resources background. But now they've done nothing since she came in and made some sort of report also. So it's all out there. I mean, this ought to be a lesson to everyone on how the system has failed, well, how the Senate Republicans have done this, and the governor is sort of tacitly going along with it, and that's wrong. I mean, they need to get a good system in place, bring in some independent people to look at the system we have now, come up with a better system for the House and Senate and how you deal with these issues. Need to look at what the Me Too situation is out there. I mean, we also have young pages who are there in the Senate and in the House who come up every year also. You need to deal with that situation too and figure out how we should have policies that really work. But so far, even despite all this situation, nothing is being done.
So responsibility was assigned to the Senate in general and not to the specific people who had complaints against them. Is that what happened? Am I getting that right?
Well, what happens is the taxpayer foots that bill.
Right.
Okay.
Because of that court case where she rightfully won because of the harassment and the firing. I think, you know, the big picture is we are going to have to rebase or the evolution, if you will, of the workplace and how relationships are handled. And then when we're talking about what happened at the State House, I think it's firm that something went critically wrong, and quite frankly, the taxpayers shouldn't have to pick up the bill for Senator Dix's mishandling of a situation. I think someone else should have that liability, because $1.7 million goes a long way in helping education or Medicaid, or even setting up what may be a policy of what we should look at in the state of Iowa for sexual harassment.
Okay, so the judgment was related to the institutional handling of the complaints rather than the substance of the complaints themselves.
Well, the substance drove the ruling.
Right.
The ruling comes back on the public entity as a whole.
Okay.
So, as a whole, we all pay for a mistake that in this situation, people will say, well, you know, this and that, but in this situation, it was the Senate Republicans, and they were at fault for the way they ran their office.
Okay.
So I look at it as an opportunity for the state could actually put in place, you know, one of the best policies in the United States dealing with sexual harassment and how you should do that. And I think there are policies in other places where you could look at that, but there's no attempts to really be made to do that. It's all sort of a cover-up situation.
What would a good policy look like?
Well, I think you'd put in place training, and you put in guidelines, and you explicit guidelines on what you're supposed to do and what you're not supposed to do, and how in the workplace are you to operate, and so people understand what's what's entailed here and what's going on. And part of this is a learning experience too. You know, I mean, these things have always been going on for years, but now finally, they see the light of day with a lot of you know, prominent people, and so now's the opportunity to take that and put in place policies that, and the state should be a leader in it. You know.
Yes.
And it should be the legislature as well as people working for state government. There should be those policies in place for the rest of state government also.
And science-based curriculum for the way
Right.
we're raising our children.
Right.
Because there's one way to act right now in the workplace, and that is evolving. We don't want anyone to feel that shunning or that pressure, and we also want workplaces to be comfortable too. You know, where people can work together without the fear of any syllable coming out of your mouth, but you have to be smart enough to know what to say. I think we have to start young. Start young,
Right.
and that's how we teach both our young boys what the world is like, and also our young girls how to react or what their world looks like too.
Are there obstacles right now to that kind of social training? I know that sex ed is a very touchy subject, and there are lots of rigid guidelines teachers have to follow when they address those subjects in school. Is that kind of social sex ed? Is that something that we can do?
I think there's a lot of people looking at it right now saying what's effective, because it was mentioned earlier there's training being done, and there's some big arguments going on that, well, that is training, that's good, but it's not truly effective, or it's not really new world or what we're dealing with today in the world of social media and the world of work. So I think it's going to be quite an effort to determine what's effective and what's meaningful and what isn't. You know, there's a number of ideas, and frankly, it's going to have to be a table, a group of people from all walks of life having some input into that. It can't be all women, it can't be all men, it can't be 20-year-old, it can't be 60-year-old. We have to have a good circle of people who have investment, who want to put together good policy.
Awesome.
And I'm afraid there probably isn't the will to do that. It's just, you know, I assume that the Senate Republicans think this is just going to go away at some point and we'll get out of the media and that sort of thing. And that doesn't solve anything. That's just, you know, sweeping it under the rug. And I hope that we're able to talk about this and bring up ways to move forward on it, because it is the opportunity to do that. And they have the opportunity in D.C. too. I don't see them taking advantage of it, but they have the opportunity in D.C. also.
Wonderful, wonderful. Well, I have taken more than an hour of your time. I want to thank you, Dave and Bob.
Thank
for
you.
your service.
Thank you.
And thank you for taking the time to chat with us today. Do you have any parting message, anything else to add, other than Happy New Year?
Well, especially this year, the one thing that elections have consequences, and the 2018 will have enormous consequences. I know we say that every couple of years, but the 2018 election, especially in Iowa, tremendous consequences. And the governor is up. I mean, there are a number of candidates running for governor on the Republican Democratic side. They're going all over Iowa. People out there get a chance to go see them, listen to them, ask them questions, that kind of thing. That's really important. And then the legislature is up again also. So there needs to be some changes, or we're keep moving backward in Iowa in 2018 and nationally. So 2018 election is really critical, and people need to be involved.
What are you going to do after you retire? Are you going to be rejoining the city council in Coralville?
I've done that once. I don't know. No, it's going to be a really interesting situation since I've done this for so long, and it's been kind of routine and all that.
Yeah.
It's really going to. So I hope to open up and do a lot of different things once that. And as Dave said, I have two daughters also. Yeah. One's living in Denver and one in D.C. So there'll be a lot of trips there too.
I hope you get a chance to really enjoy yourself. Yeah. And you, Dave.
Oh, just thank you for your time and the opportunity to talk to Coralville, and the door is always open at the Capitol to come visit, January through the end of April, maybe third week
End
of
of
April.
End of April.
And email, call. Really want to hear from you.
All right. Thank you, gentlemen, and have a great day.
All right.
Hey.
Thanks for joining us for CoralVision's annual legislative preview show. This discussion was recorded on January 3rd, 2018. The opinions expressed in this program are those of the participants and do not reflect the positions or policies of CoralVision, its employees, or the Coralville City Administration.